Today has been a fantastic start to explore what I think is going to be the most exciting 10 years in aged care and retirement living. In this next 10 years, the fundamental change in our customer, we've already started to talk about today, is going to bring opportunities and threats that are going to be critical to the way that we work and the way that we prosper in the future. When we look at the potential in aged care and retirement living, too often I think we are wedded to an analysis of the population, of the numbers of people. I would argue that it is the character and the expectations of that population which will be even more influential on where we are in 2035. The winners in the future, I believe, are those that are going to be able to respond to the aspirations of those changing consumers and also the changing expectations of the people that have to pay for the services that those consumers receive. This morning has set me up really nicely because there's been some fantastic assessments of some of the key elements that I think are going to shape the sector. I'm going to work through some of these relatively quickly and refer where I can to the previous speakers, and I'm going to come up with our picture of what we think aged care and retirement living will look like in 2035. And it'll offend some of you, I hope it does. And we'll get to go back to that first slide of winners, losers and ostriches at the end. But when we work through all of this, this is about views of the future. And so no one knows exactly where we're going to be. The first that we've had a chance to talk about today is around consumers. I started in aged care and retirement living, I hate to say it, but nearly 30 years ago, and I was really drawn in by a similar graph to this. There would have been not such sexy graphics in those days. But I was a young accountant trying desperately to get away from accounting and into consulting, and I looked at this and thought, this is going to be so exciting. That huge, big increase in the number of people requiring support and services, I thought that would be part of the most exciting thing. What is the most exciting thing and what I'm most looking forward to in this next decade has started to be teased out today. And that is almost nothing on the left-hand side of that graph, the 50 years on the left-hand side of that graph, tells us what we will be doing or what we can expect for everything from the baby boomers onwards. The generations of clients that we've supported in the past, the builder generation in particular, has been, and I think Grant called it the frugal generation. I call it the grateful generation. And so these are people that have been through world wars and depressions. They have been somewhat grateful to fall into the jam jars of the services that we make available for them, particularly given that we've tended to be able to do that for free. The next generation of consumers are very different. They are not grateful, and they will not be told what they can and can't do with their money. And so it is this generation and our ability to fund their very high expectations that is, in my view, going to be the biggest driver of change. The economics, the social attitudes as well is going to drive a lot of change. The ageing and home preferences, we've talked about that. The task force, I think, mentioned last week that there was a survey done in which 90% of people wanted to age at home. While I don't think that will change as we go forward, I think it will become more acute. And I think the baby boomer generation will use whatever wealth they have for us to be able to keep them out of institutional models. In retirement living, I believe that we'll be moving away from pull factors where you might want to go to downsize or be with other people of your own age group. Tends to be a little bit less likely if you're in denial, pretending not to be in your own age group. And I think we'll move more towards push factors, going into retirement living because of a reality check of what we need. We also come at a really interesting change as well, and something that we often don't think about, a change in focus from baby boomers who are somewhat entitled. And if you talk to baby boomers, they've got a reason to be entitled. They've come from fairly modest backgrounds, from builder families, frugal or grateful families, and they have built themselves up and their wealth to put us in the situation that we are today. Their focus on productivity and the accumulation of wealth is critical. However, also entitled is my generation, X, and the millennial snowflakes, Y and Z coming behind. They're born into entitlement. We just expect this stuff because we don't know anything different. But we also know that the huge cost impost of these people coming through the system means that our entitlement is at risk. And so the power of generation X, Y and Z is becoming more and more dominant, and it will change over the next 10 years as more of the older generation of baby boomers start to leave us. The economics has not been a surprise to us either. So this is something that was originally touted in 2002 in the first intergenerational report. And for those of you who remember that, Peter Costello made some really important comments, and he was starting to test the public's perception of how much is too much in terms of taxpayer funding. And I'm not just talking about aged care. One of the graphs that came up earlier with Chris today was on healthcare as well. For how much longer are we going to be able to continue to subsidise people? At the start, when he wrote his report, aged care, government spending on aged care was less than 1%. It's doubled since then. It will triple, particularly given Fair Work decision last week, it will triple by the time the baby boomers hit their straps. And I understand Grant's comments earlier. We differ on this in terms of care fees. We are unique in that we don't, the taxpayer almost fully funds care fees in residential aged care and home care. But we're unique because we don't have a universal system. We have a safety net system, and our ability to be able to continue to operate in this way gets harder and harder as we go through. And this is really critical. So we've got a trebling of the costs associated with government-funded expenditure, but from when Costello first raised this to us in 2002, we've actually halved the number of taxpayers available to fund it. They're disappearing. And the wealthiest generation by a mile, controlling nearly 50% of the country's wealth, is the baby boomer generation. And so the younger generations will be then asked to fund almost a tripling of costs towards those services in the future. And at the same time, another really good comment that has come up today is just around the acute sector as well. And you can see there that over the last 30 years, the demand for hospital services has doubled for younger people, and for over 65s it's increased by 350%. By 2035, half of the people in hospitals will be people that are older, and our ability to be able to move them into appropriate accommodation, appropriate for them and appropriate for us, so that we are not bed blocking in the way that we discussed today, becomes absolutely paramount. The availability of clinicians is one of the most critical aspects that forward projections has not evaluated enough. The situation in Australia is actually not that bad. In fact, except for Scandinavian countries, our ratio of nurses to older people is actually really good. And if we ignore the fact that 26% of nurses are past retirement age, and assume that we can keep on building and importing nurses, particularly from developing countries, to meet the ratios that we've been given, then our very best efforts will still result in a situation with that orange line where the proportion of nurses to older people must go down because that growth in older people comes so quickly. So our ability to be able to meet our 44 minutes or whatever it is in the future gets harder and harder. In fact, whatever we're achieving at the moment, 38 minutes, by the time the baby boomers hit their peak, we'll be down to around about 21 minutes. So we need to rethink about how we use our medicos and our nurses in locations and in formats that best use those clinicians going forward. We've talked well today about residential aged care and investment in residential aged care. We've looked at it in a different way, but this is a nice, simple graphic way of showing it. Funding cuts in 2016. There was a little delay for those homes that were already committed in 2016, and you can see there that it just falls off a cliff. So our projections around how many nursing homes we were going to need, the government keeps changing it. At one point it was 55,000 beds and an investment of $85 billion. We're readjusting that, deferring that, analysing that. I think fantastic news coming from the task force last week. I think that's terrific to make, as Rachel pointed out, making it more viable for those that are providing, but also to Simon's comments that the returns that we're looking at now, particularly with the uncertainty of all those other parts of the jigsaw, means that I don't think that the level of investment in residential aged care can support us as we do today. And that's not in itself just a bad thing. In Australia, we have one of the longest lengths of stay and the highest proportion of older people that end up in residential aged care of all OECD countries. And so I expect that the number of residential aged care services will not continue to increase in the way that they have, and how we deploy resources to make sure the ones that we do have is well aligned. We just heard feedback on the amount of the recommendations that have been implemented by government for the Royal Commission. I just want to maybe rephrase the way that we look at the Minister saying how far we've gone. What Ian Yates just said was that the recommendation, this is recommendation 25, the most important recommendation of the Royal Commission was a new aged care system, an integrated entitlement-based user-paid system, one in which it is seamless between residential aged care and home care, entitlement-based. And that is the most important recommendation, because when you look at all the other recommendations, a lot of them were actually couched in terms of what we would do if we had a new model, including the Act itself. So if you don't do that most important recommendation, you end up with this situation where we are rationing out the available services as best we can and as best as we can afford. And I just want to come back quickly on means-tested care fees on that. I know there is not a political appetite to address this or the way that we means-test the family home. But what ends up happening is we end up with too many of us in the safety net, and we end up rationing a smaller number of services or services that don't meet our need. And our ability to be able to address that becomes easier when that very powerful generation, the baby boomer generation, move through the system, and X, Y and Z start to have a greater say in where their taxpayer dollars are going. The other thing that I think is going to be important too is I don't think a rationed, homogenous system, fully taxpayer funded, delivers the outcome that the baby boomers are going to want. And so their expectations or their thoughts that getting it for free is a good outcome for them, I think is going to be somewhat short-sighted. So we have all of those different elements that form part of the aged care puzzle. And when we look at how that might look at the future, and I don't think anyone would argue that there wasn't change ahead, I want to come back to this. And a couple of comments have come down before. Ian and Simon mentioned that we have these very tight jam jars of funding, residential aged care and home care. And then we have a retirement living unfunded, but as you can hear today, starting to become more and more part of the system. In 2008, I found a way of thinking outside of these jam jars. I was asked by the new Conservative government of New Zealand to lead a team to review the residential aged care sector in New Zealand. And what I found in a fairly short period of time is that the Kiwis were onto something quite more advanced than we were. Not because, you'd never want to say because Kiwis are smarter, but they can't afford to over-subsidise services the way that we do. And they only have one level of government, two levels of government, but only one responsible for funding. And so some of the blame shifting and the funding shifting between hospitals and residential aged care and home care start to disappear, and they become more portable, and they start to reflect more what consumers want. This is at the start of an 18-month review, and I had to get my head around it really, really quickly, because they thought someone coming from a larger country would be able to tell them something that they didn't know. This was not the case. And so the thing that really helped me, that might help you, is that the future is all home care. It will double in size, but it's all home care. It will just take place in different environments. And these are the four environments that I think will dominate in 2035. The first is subacute, residential aged care, but more towards high complexity and palliative. The average entry age is going to go higher, and the average length of stay will drop from about 2.5 years to about 18 months. It will continue to be taxpayer funded, but at this stage, by 2035, X, Y, and Z will have had a greater input and contribution towards these services, and users will be making a proper contribution to means-tested care fees. That will reflect in greater expectations for quality. Nothing drives quality faster than asking people to pay for stuff. RADs will still exist, but we will be moving faster towards DAPs, particularly when we become more realistic about what goes into delivering a RAD when we're only expecting to stay there for 12 months or 18 months. That average length of stay will be pushed out by people with challenging behaviours. There still will be heavy regulation. To Simon's point about the level of government funding following regulation, I think there will be staffing mandates, but there's a mathematical certainty that they cannot be at the level that they are at the moment. A registered nurse should only do what only a registered nurse should do. If we only use registered nurses for those services, then their roles become more around leadership, mentoring, and oversight. And because of that, there will be a new care workforce. There will be a specialised care workforce, as operates in the UK and other places in the world at the moment. And that specialised workforce will relieve some of the doing stuff that we're asking our registered nurses to do, and dangerously asking them to go back to doing, having already improved the skilled extension of our care workforce. There will be much more partnership with the acute sector, and indeed more direct ownership by hospital groups going forward. And one of the other confrontational things that I believe is that generations X, Y, and Z will be looking very closely at benevolent organisations that don't pay tax and are not focused primarily on a benevolent cause. Meaning, I think that the for-profit sector will play a larger part in the middle to upper areas, and the not-for-profit will look after people with more benevolent requirements, those with financial and social disadvantage. And that transition and that movement, I believe, will be in play by 2035. The second and perhaps the most exciting area for me, I'm calling it assisted living. It's called care service or service departments when we go around the world. This will look after the mid to low complexity of RACs. It's part of what Simon was talking about before. It will be predominantly consumer funded with government support as if they were home care clients. It will be led by specialised carers. It might be a nurse in charge, but the focus will be around social, and it will be consumer-directed services with reduced regulation. For me, it's one of the most exciting areas, and one of the areas that I think will develop exponentially over the next 10 years. It'll take two forms. There are care homes, those developments, those dwellings that are primarily built to look after people with care needs, and there will be a continuum of care villages, which are those that provide for a myriad of independence and then offer specialised care services within the villages. Care homes, they're called assisted living, I mentioned in the US, they're service departments, care suites, Chris called them in New Zealand. They are residential care homes in UK. In Australia, they exist, and we've touched on some of them today. There's a number of you here, I know, today. LDK provides such services. Odyssey, Abbeyfield, English model, primarily looking after the financially disadvantaged. These will grow and grow over time. A continuum of care villages. Those villages that are providing more and more of those services. I'm looking at the modern continuum of care retirement villages, particularly in the US, understanding that some of the dated ones are getting harder to move. And then retirement villages that you see with that integration I mentioned before within New Zealand. Affordable villages, I think, is also an area of contention. And I believe that affordable villages will continue to be land lease communities, but I think they will also be those villages, particularly dated villages, that provide nothing but an accommodation offering. I believe that these services will be offering a homogenous offering to a heterogeneous market, and I think they will be somewhat challenged. That is a risk for those who continue to build mid to high quality accommodation and do not want to provide services beyond the accommodation component. And I think that we will in this area increasingly transition to rental models from those that are still on DMF. Community-based home care, and when I get to the scale of this might surprise you as well, is that I don't see the growth that we normally project when we put it forward, not because we don't want it, largely because I think we'll be restricted in our ability to be able to provide the services because we'll continue to ration, but also the number of humans available to care for us at home in the wider community will become less. And as we need to make a greater contribution to our care services, particularly as our functional dependence increases, means that the need for us to be able to congregate at some level will be greater. It will still be the largest market. The grey tech, I love that. That's a really interesting and a great way of looking at it. IntelliCare is here today that do a lot of that. But supportive technologies will become, as we've said today, really critical, particularly for those people who have less access to humans. By 2035, I don't expect robots to be running around doing a lot of our work. What does that look like in terms of scale? Well, you'll have very different views about that. Certainly the projections that are being put forward by government with their expectations for the future is very different. For us, our view is that our dependence on residential aged care as a proportion of older people will come down quite considerably, and that length of stay shift to 12 to 18 months will be part of that, but a big part of it will be this direct service substitution in assisted living for that mid to low level. That area will still have average length of stay. In the UK, the average length of stay is still about 2.8 years, and most people will die in assisted living. The amount of transition from assisted living into subacute or residential aged care sits at around about the 20% mark, so most people will spend all of their lives there. The affordable villages, I think, are already growing and becoming a great area for support. They'll be part of that community-based home support, and out in residential, we're expecting there'll be between 1.2 and 1.4 under the subsidised system. So in all of that, some of you will agree and disagree. The ostriches among us will be those organisations who, from fear or reform fatigue, decide to do nothing. None of us believe that we are ostriches, but business history tells us that most of us are. They are the organisation who will stand still. They will wait for government or competitors or property markets to direct our next move. If their balance sheets are strong, their demise will be slow. Losers, in my view, are those organisations that continue to build a homogenous service to meet a heterogeneous baby boomer generation. They'll meet that generation by increasing the numbers to get to the baby boomers, but not the characteristics of the baby boomers. And their death will be fast. The winners amongst us will be you sitting here, either nodding or shaking your head, but forming your own view about what that future might look like. Having formed the view of what that future might look like, you will want to position yourselves within that future and pivot your models and move towards that. I know some of you that I work with are doing that already. That is the most exciting part of the future, and those are the organisations that will be successful. Agree or disagree, don't be an ostrich. This is the most exciting change our sector has ever seen and will ever see past it, because this is the period of transition. And I'm really looking forward, whatever path you choose, I'm really looking forward to sharing it with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cam. If I summarise that last point you were making, or you made it several times, rather than having, or we could either stick with what we're doing, homogenous, or we could reach out. So what you're saying, the marketers are going to have a field day, aren't they?
Yes.
So marketing is going to be a major function, i.e. identifying the customer, designing a product, and then executing that product.
Yes, I think doing the research to try and understand much better than we do now the changing expectations. And also within the baby boomer cohort, there are differences within them as well, particularly those immediately after the Second World War are somewhat different to the younger baby boomer generation. So making sure that we have a good understanding of what those expectations are and working, I think, in freer markets, which I think Simon was talking to, enables us to move around a little more. I think the other thing too is being a little bit realistic about what residential aged care will look like in the future. What we're going to be able to afford to do and what we have the humans to deliver is going to be absolutely critical. It lends itself for fantastic opportunities in residential aged care and huge amounts of creativity in retirement living, but also care homes as a standalone substitute.
If I can attack you kindly, everything you're talking about relates to property, and yet really what people are after are products and services. So, Simon is doing an outreach into the community and providing services and so on. You'd be really advocating the same, wouldn't you? Again, because we're not going to have the staff. So it's got to be a total rethink of how we package together support.
Yeah, but two things. One is the availability of people to be able to deliver services and the realities of how logistics will work as the population ages, but also how we're going to pay for things. And so at some point, we're going to have to address the elephant in the room, the means testing of the family home, the number of people that are protected in the safety net, and having 96% or 98% of our direct care costs subsidised by a shrinking taxpayer base. When that taxpayer base becomes more powerful and the baby boomer generations start to disappear, then the reality check on that is also going to make a huge difference in the way that we design our services and how we deliver them.
Yeah, but I could argue, we're worried about means testing. The reality is the baby boomer bypasses the means testing, said, I'm going to pay for it myself. I don't need to be means tested, I'm just going to pay for it because I want it. So you, the marketer, give me the products and services where I want it and at a price that I can afford, and I'll pay for it.
Absolutely. So the winning service in that context then is those that can facilitate denial. I want to spend the last of my life doing the things that I love. I do not want to be defined by my disability. That is the marketing challenge.
Yeah. Great opportunity. Thank you very much. Can we show our appreciation?